President?
Yeah, the same one he appointed. Why? Because according to Trump, Powell won't cut rates fast enough to save Trump's trade war. This isn't a policy disagreement. It's a political hit job, disguised as monetary strategy. Trump created the tariffs. Powell warned they'd spark inflation. Trump demanded rate cuts. Powell refused. Now, Trump's pushing the Supreme Court to tear down the Fed's legal protections, just so he can fire the man who says no. This isn't about interest rates, it's about control. And if Trump wins, the Federal Reserve won't just be politicized, it'll be weaponized. Because once a president dictates monetary policy, what's left of the dollar? Except politics? Here's the twist. This isn't just about the Fed. It's about erasing the line between money and politics. The real question is, who's really playing politics here? Jerome Powell has been labeled too late by Donald Trump, accused of dragging his feet, misreading markets, and refusing to lower interest rates fast enough. Back in 2018, Powell wasn't appointed by a Democratic administration. He was handpicked by Trump himself. Powell was not an academic economist like his predecessors, but a lawyer and investment banker with experience at the Carlyle Group. Someone Trump believed would break from the technocratic mold and respond more intuitively to economic shifts. But soon after Powell raised interest rates in response to overheating indicators in 2018 to 2019, Trump turned against him, calling him an enemy on par with China. Since returning to the White House, Trump has once again targeted Powell, arguing that the Fed is playing politics by not cutting rates amid the new trade war. The contradiction is glaring. Trump himself launched sweeping new tariffs, a 145% levy on Chinese imports and a 10% blanket tariff on most non-retaliating countries. Powell, in response, warned that these tariffs could drive up inflation and force the Fed into a dangerous trade-off. Either let inflation rise or tighten monetary policy and risk unemployment. Trump, instead of acknowledging the pressure tariffs place on prices, demands rate cuts to offset the very inflation those tariffs are expected to create. What makes this reversal even more dramatic is the legal context. Powell has firmly stated he would not resign, even if asked. Legally, Federal Reserve chairs cannot be dismissed for policy disagreements. They serve 4-year terms and can only be removed for cause, typically misconduct or incapacity, Trump versus Fed chairman. Still, Trump insists, if I want him out, he'll be out of there real fast. That claim isn't just bluster, it's backed by an active legal strategy. Trump's team is pushing the Supreme Court to revisit a 1935 ruling, Humphrey's Executor versus United States, that protects leaders of independent agencies from political dismissal. If the court overturns it, Trump could gain the legal footing to fire Powell, not for wrongdoing, but for non-compliance with presidential policy. And there's a deeper irony. During Trump's first term, he often accused Powell of moving too slowly to cut rates. Yet when the Fed slashed interest rates to near zero during the COVID crisis, Trump praised the move. Fast forward to 2025. Now, in his second term, Trump once again wants rapid monetary easing. But this time, Powell is holding firm. His reason? The inflation Powell helped tame is at risk of roaring back due to volatile trade policy. Even Christine Lagarde, president of the European Central Bank, indirectly echoed Powell's concerns, noting that Trump's tariffs had created exceptional uncertainty in the global economy. So who's really politicizing the Fed? The president, who's demanding rate cuts to counter the effects of his own trade war during an election cycle? Or the Fed chair, who insists that decisions be based on data, not political timing? This isn't a debate over monetary theory. It's a power struggle over whether the Federal Reserve can remain the last firewall between politics and the price of money. The clash between Trump and Powell isn't just theoretical, it's already sending shockwaves through the global financial system. Just hours after Powell warned that Trump's tariffs could stoke inflation, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged more than 700 points. The S&P 500 and Nasdaq followed, both closing sharply lower. Investors are no longer simply reacting to macroeconomic data, they're bracing for unpredictable political interference in monetary policy. And the deeper the conflict gets, the more volatile the markets become. Trump's tariff policies have already begun to reshape expectations across industries. The Yale Budget Lab estimates that the inflationary impact of these tariffs will cost the average American household an additional $4,900 per year, a de facto tax that isn't voted on in Congress, but is instead passed through prices at checkout. Tech giants like Nvidia and AMD are forecasting multi-billion-dollar losses due to retaliatory restrictions and export limitations from China, as well as new rules imposed by the US government itself. Airlines and manufacturers are now issuing dual financial forecasts, one assuming a soft landing, the other anticipating a tariff-driven recession. Even the European Central Bank has cut rates 7 times this year, a move they attribute to the exceptional uncertainty driven largely by Trump's erratic trade policy. It's a ripple effect. When Washington wavers, the world adjusts. In contrast, the Fed has held rates steady, wary of further inflaming inflation. This divergence has widened currency volatility and pushed investors into a state of near-perpetual caution. Some analysts warn that the uncertainty is beginning to resemble the atmosphere before the 2008 financial crisis, not in substance, but in psychological fragility. Consumer confidence, too, is sliding. Survey data released in mid-April shows Americans increasingly pessimistic about job security and real wages. The spike in prices caused by tariffs, combined with stubbornly high borrowing costs, is squeezing household budgets. Even as inflation has cooled statistically, everyday essentials, groceries, eggs, gas, remain elevated in perception. The White House says the economy is strong. The Fed says it's stable but vulnerable. But Main Street feels something different: unease, unpredictability, and growing doubt. And markets hate nothing more than doubt. At the heart of this crisis lies a constitutional question. Can the President of the United States fire the chair of the Federal Reserve for disagreeing with him? Legally, the answer, for now, is no. Under the Federal Reserve Act and long-standing precedent from the 1935 Supreme Court case, Humphrey's Executor versus United States, leaders of independent agencies, including the Fed, can only be removed for cause. That typically means misconduct, negligence, or incapacity, not mere disagreement over monetary policy. But Trump is actively trying to change that. His administration has brought a case to the Supreme Court that could overturn Humphrey's Executor. The case itself doesn't involve the Fed directly. It centers on Trump's removal of officials from 2 lesser-known agencies, the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, and the Merit Systems Protection Board, MSPB. But the legal strategy is clear. If the court strikes down tenure protections for those agencies, it would open the door for a broader campaign to give the executive branch direct control over all independent agencies, including the Federal Reserve. The Trump administration has argued in its filings that the president should not be forced to delegate executive power to agency heads who are demonstrably at odds with the administration's policy objectives. Solicitor General D. John Sauer told the court that these limitations undermine the president's constitutional authority. While the Department of Justice insists that the Federal Reserve is not the target of this case, multiple justices, including Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, have openly questioned the legitimacy of agency independence in prior rulings. The stakes couldn't be higher. If Trump wins this legal battle, he may gain the authority to fire Powell, not for corruption, but for refusing to lower interest rates. That would set a precedent with global consequences. It would signal that monetary policy, long shielded from short-term political cycles, is now subject to presidential pressure. And it would shake the very foundation of why the US dollar has been trusted for generations, because it was seen as immune to the whims of politics. Even Powell himself has acknowledged the case. "We're monitoring the situation carefully," he said, but he also reiterated the principle that our independence is a matter of law. His refusal to resign, even if asked, is not defiance. It's a defense of structure, a signal to markets, foreign governments, and future leaders that the rules haven't changed yet, but the court could change them at any moment. For over a century, the Federal Reserve has operated on one foundational idea: independence. That independence from Congress, from the White House, from elections, is what gives the Fed credibility. And that credibility is what gives the dollar strength. Global investors, sovereign funds, and financial institutions don't just buy US treasuries because they're profitable. They buy them because they're stable, because they trust that US monetary policy is insulated from politics. But if that trust is broken, if Powell can be fired for refusing to cut rates, then the Fed is no longer an independent central bank. It becomes an extension of the presidency. And that changes everything. The consequences would ripple far beyond Washington. A politicized Fed could weaken global demand for the US dollar, still the world's primary reserve currency. Foreign investors, wary of monetary policy being dictated by electoral pressures, may seek alternatives: the euro, the Chinese yuan, or even digital currencies backed by commodities. Over time, that shift could erode America's ability to finance its debt cheaply, run persistent deficits, or project economic influence abroad. Economists have sounded the alarm. Eswar Prasad of Cornell University described Trump's repeated attacks on Powell as deeply disturbing, warning that they threaten to unravel domestic and foreign investors' faith in the dollar. And it's not just economists. Senator Elizabeth Warren, often a critic of Powell herself, said bluntly, "If Powell can be fired, the markets will crash." It's a rare bipartisan moment when both progressive lawmakers and conservative economists agree the independence of the Fed is not optional, it's existential. Meanwhile, Powell's position grows more precarious. Despite steering the economy through COVID, managing the largest inflation spike in 4 decades, and executing the soft landing that few believed was possible, he now faces the most politically fraught moment of his tenure. And yet, his strategy remains unchanged: data over politics, long-term stability over short-term popularity. "We don't take political considerations into account," he has said. "We do what's best for the American people." But even the most principled approach may not survive a structural change. If the Supreme Court dismantles the legal wall around the Fed, Powell's future and the Fed's independence could hinge not on macroeconomics, but on political loyalty. And in that world, every Fed chair becomes temporary. Every rate decision becomes partisan, and every recession becomes a campaign issue. In short, it wouldn't just be the Fed that changes, it would be America's place in the global economy. So now we arrive at the real question. This was never just about Jerome Powell. Not really. This is about whether America's economic steering wheel still belongs to policy or to politics. Whether interest rates are set by data or by decree. Whether the value of the dollar is determined by independent institutions or by whoever sits in the Oval Office. Because if the president can fire the Fed chair for not cutting rates during an election year, for decades, global investors trusted the dollar not because America was perfect, but because its institutions were strong. Because decisions about inflation, growth, and employment were made slowly, methodically, and with restraint. But what happens when that restraint disappears? What happens when a Fed chair is expected to obey the president? Not the mandate, What happens when financial markets no longer ask, what will the Fed do? But instead, what does the White House want? That's the question the world is now watching. And perhaps the more urgent question for Americans is this: do we still want the Fed to be independent, or are we ready to let politics print our money, set our rates, and steer our future? Drop a comment for more breaking news.